Good afternoon, everyone, from Moscow and Boise, Idaho, and Williamsburg, Virginia. This is a special edition of the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium devoted to election law and litigation. Our topic is strict construction or serious confusion. Before introducing today's panel of election law experts, I would like to just tell our regular University of Idaho audience that we will take a break next week for Thanksgiving. And the next colloquium will be Tuesday, December 1st, featuring Michael Porella, Dean of our College of Agricultural and Life Sciences, speaking about the Idaho Cafe, the Center for Agriculture, Food, and Education. And also that Friday, tomorrow, is the first deadline for proposals for the colloquium for spring of 2021. And we invite presentations by faculty, postdocs, visiting scholars, emeritus faculty who are speaking about their teaching, collaborative efforts, their creative activity, and their scholarship. And you can email me at kbird@uidaho.edu with that information. Today, we are trying to catch up with what's been going on since our election 16 days ago. It's been 12 days since major news organizations declared Joe Biden the winner of the presidential election based on his victory in Pennsylvania. Yet every day we learn of new challenges to election results in some states, even at the county level. What's going on? Our panel of legal experts will help us better understand US election law and assess the validity of the legal maneuvering by the Trump campaign. Let me introduce our three panelists. Benjamin Plenner Cover is an associate professor at the University of Idaho College of Law. He has written about the petition clause and partisan gerrymandering and has served as a peer reviewer for Election Law Journal. He currently serves on the executive committee of the election law section of the American Association of Law Schools. Jason Dominguez is a temporary faculty member at the U of I's College of Law. Jason has been an assistant professor of law at the Thurgood Marshall School of Law and an adjunct professor at Santa Barbara and Ventura Colleges of Law. He has more than 20 years of practice experience and has been a deputy county counsel, a deputy city attorney, a deputy district attorney, and a member of the Santa Barbara City Council. Rebecca Green is a professor of the practice of law at the William and Mary Law School and co-director of the Election Law Program, a joint project of the law school and the National Center for State Courts. Professor Green's research interests focus on the intersection of privacy law and elections, most recently on the topic of election transparency. And I'd like to extend a special welcome to Professor Cover's Law 901 election law class who are joining us from Boise as well as from Moscow. So welcome to those law students joining our regular Renfrew Colloquium audience. Let's start with a question for all of the panelists. The recently fired director of US cybersecurity, Chris Krebs, called this year's election the most secure in US history. Yet each day we learn of new and false claims of voter fraud by the president and his allies. What should we make of this latest tactic, these attempts to block certification of results by boards of canvassers in Wayne County, Michigan, and elsewhere? So Benji, do you want to start and follow with Jason and then Rebecca?
Sure. So thank you so much for having us. I'm delighted to be on this panel, and thank you for everyone who came today. There have been a lot of allegations. I would encourage people to distinguish between allegations at press conferences, allegations on social media, and allegations in court. You know, all sorts of allegations have been made on social media. There was a press conference this morning with Rudy Giuliani where he made you know, lots of very serious allegations referring to kind of a nationwide conspiracy to rig the election. But those are not the allegations that are being made in courts. And there's been a lot of lawsuits that have been filed. I've been trying my best to keep up with all the lawsuits that have been filed. I've gotten a lot of assistance from two of my students who are here today who are helping me as research assistants, Alex Siebert and Trevor Buller. And even with their wonderful assistance, it's been very hard to keep up with all of the lawsuits that have been filed. But to the best of my knowledge, based on everything that I've seen, these lawsuits are not alleging a nationwide conspiracy. A bunch of these lawsuits are alleging procedural issues related to how much access representatives of the campaign can have in the room watching the counting process. You know, and it's not a question that there's nobody in the room. It's a question of how close they can be to the process. So it's relatively technical procedural issues. You know, there's a lot of the litigation said that the people who are running the election did not properly follow certain aspects of state law. That's not an allegation that any individual voter engaged in voter fraud. It's really an argument about the best interpretation of state laws that are, you know, potentially subject to multiple interpretations. And what I have seen over and over again, and I tried to compile some examples, which maybe I'll share later in the discussion, is you know, over and over again, judges asking attorneys, "Are you alleging that there was any fraud in this case?" And the attorney saying that that's not the allegation that we're making. And in fact, Rudy Giuliani himself appeared in court yesterday in federal district court, I believe in the middle district for Pennsylvania. And the judge asked him directly if there was, if the amended complaint contained any allegations of fraud. And Rudy Giuliani says, no, we're not alleging fraud with particularity. We're not alleging fraud in this case. I'm trying to track down the clip of that. But you know, I'll leave it at that for now. But what I find so remarkable is how huge the difference is between the claims being made outside of courtrooms versus the relatively technical procedural claims that are being made in courtrooms.
So, Jason, what are you seeing? Anything to add beyond Benji's initial observation there?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, you know, as the title of the presentation talks about strict construction. We had Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, not really understanding what strict scrutiny was, or at least that's what he said in court, I believe it was yesterday. And the other part of the title deals with serious confusion. And I think we do have a lot of confusion here. The heart of the confusion stems from the difference between what lawyers are allowed to say in court, where they're often under oath, or where judges are asking them direct questions, versus what they can say in front of a news camera, in front of a press release. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion stems from. Another part of the confusion stems from the difference between what some Republican figureheads are saying and what others are saying. There's a divide amongst the Republican Party. And I think today one of the key questions we need to address is how far are some of these state lawmakers and federal lawmakers in Congress, or even the VP or president himself, how far are they willing to go to try to keep Trump in the White House? Are they willing to hang up state law and certification of results? We're seeing battles now really congealing around the certification of results in Wayne County in Michigan, in Georgia, in Pennsylvania. That's really where they're looking at the crux of the matter is, can these get certified? Because if they're not certified, that then shifts the decision-making to the federal government and the House and the Senate on what they're going to do if they get non-certified results from states, particularly the three major battleground states, Georgia, Arizona, and Philadelphia or Pennsylvania. So those are the three states. And I think the framework I'd like to examine is what are these state lawmakers going to do when push comes to shove?
Rebecca, thank you for joining us. From your perspective in Virginia, what are you seeing? What's the mood and what's your sense of how serious these challenges are to the election results?
Yeah, so I think I'll offer just a few positive reflections first, which, I think it's easy to get really tied up in all the scary scenarios that might unfold. But the first positive thing that I hope doesn't get lost in the mix is the fact that we ran a successful election in a pandemic. And, leading up to the election, I and many others were concerned about everything from voter intimidation to poll workers not showing up and everything in between and then some. And, we spent a lot of time tabletop exercising and figuring out all the various problems that we could confront. And the fact that our election unfolded as well as it did, especially in such a high turnout election, I think is something that is getting lost in the mix as this post-election process unfolds. So I think, that's sort of the first good news. We didn't have a hurricane on election day that disrupted, an entire state. I mean, there's just so much that went right. So that is, I feel that, it's worth pausing to just remember that thankfully we are in that position. The second sort of positive slant I think we can take from this pre-election and post-election period is how resilient and effective our court system has been. We had, I think, by last count, over 300 cases brought prior to the election, challenging, various restrictions on voting, especially voting in a pandemic. And our courts rose to that challenge. You may quibble with the results one way or the other, but the fact of the matter is that courts resolved disputes. People accepted those resolutions, and the election occurred. And even in the post-election, context, you've had, as Benji was talking about, you've had, certainly kind of maybe different arguments being made in those courts versus what's being said in press conferences. And yet that's a feature of our system working. In other words, where truth matters in a court of law. And I have to believe that, even despite the political polarization that we're seeing, the toxic political polarization that we're seeing, that our courts will continue to play that role in terms of being final arbiters of the truth, that people will accept and that people will accept those outcomes or continue to accept those outcomes. So I thought maybe just kind of injecting those two sort of positive takeaways from the last several months, you might be a little bit of a helpful orientation as you sort of, your mind sort of spins out of control as you look at all the things the problems that face us.
Thank you, that was very helpful. I've got a follow-up question for each of the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to questions from our audience. And some of you who've been studying election law since August may have some different angles on what's going on. But first, for Benji, I thought it would be helpful. Could you refresh our knowledge of American government and just explain the role of the Electoral College in choosing the president? And then as a corollary to that, do you think the Electoral College should be abolished, or perhaps the procedures amended so that the way that the votes are allocated from each state are changed? So help us with what's happening between the time of the popular vote and the time the Electoral College meets.
Sure. So, here's what we know for sure. If you look at the US Constitution, Articles 1, 2, and 3 deal respectively with the legislative branch, Article 1, legislative, Article 2, judicial branch, Article 3. And if you look at Article 2, It doesn't say there shall be a national election for president. What it says, what it does is it establishes this thing called the Electoral College, which, you know, I'm guessing that a lot of people in the room are familiar with to different extents, but I'm going to just try to do the short and sweet version and hit the main things that are relevant to today's discussion, which is that, you know, we don't, the American people do not directly elect the president. The people who actually cast the votes for the president are presidential electors, and each state gets a number of electors that's equal to the number of senators it has, so 2 senators per state, plus the number of representatives it gets in the House, which depends on population. So it's, you know, it's 2 for Idaho, but it's a lot more for California. And then pursuant to the 23rd Amendment, DC is treated like a state for purposes of the Electoral College. And so it also gets 3 electors. You have 435 members of Congress, you got 100 senators, and then you got 3 for DC. That adds up to 538 electoral votes. Half of that is 269. And so you need 270 to win. But the Constitution does not say how each state will choose its electors. It says that it's up to the state. It says you know, each state shall appoint in a manner determined by the legislature of that state. And early on in American history, some states directly appointed presidential electors without having a state popular vote, without consulting the people of the state and asking, who do you want to be president, or who do you want to choose the president? The state legislature just directly appointed people to serve as presidential electors. And there's, you know, if you look at the history of what the founders were thinking, there's a bunch of indications that they thought that presidential electors might exercise independent judgment and try to choose somebody who they thought would be preeminently qualified for the role. Now, what happened over the course of American history is that norms changed. You had the rise of the political party system. Electors began to pledge in advance who they would vote for. And usually, you know, electors were associated with a political party, and they promised in advance that if they served as electors, they would cast their electoral vote for the nominee of their party. And then legislatures, instead of appointing presidential electors directly, they asked the people of the state, who do you want to be the presidential elector? And so they had a statewide popular preference vote. And basically, you know, once you had presidential electors pledging in advance who they were going to support, you could basically just ask the people of your state, who do you want to be president? And if most of them want, you know, President Trump, then appoint the slate of presidential electors who pledge to vote for President Trump. And, you know, if the most people want President Biden, then you could appoint a slate of electors who have pledged in advance to support Joe Biden. Now, you could actually do it in a proportional way, and 2 states kind of divvy up their electors, but 48 states just choose all their electors based on whoever gets, you know, wins a plurality of the state popular vote. And so all that's really happened so far is that we've had the state popular votes, and we're doing the counts. But what's going to happen next is that on December 14th, all of the electors, that's the real election. That's when the presidential electors are going to cast their votes. And then in early January, in front of a joint session of Congress, the president of the Senate, who is the vice president, Mike Pence, is going to read out all the votes, and the votes are going to be counted in Congress. And there's a bunch of legal questions that Jason was alluding to, and that we might discuss more about if there's anything that legislatures can do to change which electors are appointed at this point. if there's anything that electors can do to choose somebody who they did not originally pledge to support, and if there's anything that members of Congress can do to refuse to count votes for a certain candidate in a certain state. And then if nobody gets a majority of the electoral votes, then Article 2 provides for a contingent election where the members of the House of Representatives choose the president, and it's the new House, but it's on a state delegation basis. So it's not 435 people casting 435 votes. It's 50 state delegations casting, one each. So for a total of 50 votes. So should this be reformed? I think so, yes. It's a very hard lift to amend the Constitution, but I don't think this is the best way to elect the president. And I think there's a very serious problem where if the majority of people want one person to be the president, but the other person gets elected. And that's happened a few times now, and it happened in 2000 and it happened in 2016. And I think that's a very serious problem for American democracy. And I think it's worth considering alternatives to the Electoral College, even though it's going to be very hard to amend the Constitution.
We may want to come back to alternatives to the Electoral College, but I have a question for Jason, who has graciously agreed to help us pick up where we left off on Tuesday with our other election panel. And this was a question from the audience that we didn't have time to address then. In a recent New Yorker essay on Trump's reasons for not conceding, Steve Cole notes the dire implications of an electoral loss for him personally on several fronts. Quoting from the New Yorker, 4 more years in the White House would extend Trump's immunity from New York prosecutors conducting active investigations into possible criminal activity, ease pressure from bank creditors, and further enrich his family businesses. A win-win-win. And Jason, how do you evaluate these factors as behind Trump's desperate machinations, as opposed to other factors such as just the sheer inability to admit to losing the election? And you need to unmute. There we go. Thanks.
We need to start by questioning whether these are desperate machinations or just what Trump does on a normal basis. I'm not sure he's necessarily acting what he would consider in an extraordinary fashion. Going back to some of the points Benji just made, I think there's certainly a ton of room for improvement in terms of the text of the Constitution, in terms of Title III, which defines the process. But the problem is, at the end of the day, there are so many steps in a process where things can fail, or more particularly where human beings can divert from norms. And that's what you see in this particular situation, is a lot of historical precedent has been thrown out the window. Doesn't necessarily mean those things are illegal, but they're just different from what predecessors have done. And the question is, can you craft a new set of rules that's both politically palatable and people will accept them, and that's going to be tough. And then 2, will they be any more efficient or effective than what we have now? And I'm not sure. And I think it's interesting, I had thought about it in terms of that. It really comes down to the men and women in these key positions and their behavior. This is why I think it's important to look at the Republicans in particular, what they're going to do at this critical juncture. And democracy's messy. You remember Winston Churchill's quote about it being the worst system except all other ones that have been tried. And I think that's what it comes down to, is rule of law is exactly that. But you need the people behind the rule of law to apply it moralistically and loyally to the country. And I don't see how you can craft a code that's going to be as short as the language we have normally in our Constitution or our United States Code that will deal with all eventualities. You really have to leave it up to the people to see what's happening. And I think the press has done a good job covering these court cases. And at the end of the day, there will be consequences for people who are seen to be abusing a system, if that's what the people believe. And it's up to the media. Both the media and our politicians are subject to private ordering. The media doesn't necessarily need 50% plus one, which is why we have the media market so fragmented. But at the end of the day, people will see through machinations, and there will be consequences. Right now in Georgia, that's going to be the first stop. There's 14 political ads currently being run for the 2 Senate seats that are up for grabs at the beginning of January. The 2 Republican contenders there have both asked for the Secretary of State to step down. And it's divided, like I mentioned earlier. The Lieutenant Governor hasn't called for that, nor has the governor. So it'll be interesting to see how that falls away. Will it be something that actually swings voters towards one set of candidates or another? It'll be interesting to see. But going back to Trump and why he's sticking with it, yes, if he stays in the presidency, he'll have 4 more years of immunity from suits that are being filed. There's state suits being filed against him in New York. There's investigations. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if they've reached actual charges yet, but there are investigations taking place related to how he's filed his taxes and business dealings. And those are things that he won't have immunity from once he leaves office. And there are also things that he won't be subject to a federal pardon from because they're state law. And then just the pure finances, the amount of money that he's able to make while he's in the presidency, how much better his businesses will do while he has all the publicity. It's free marketing for him. So those are the reasons why he'd want to stay in office. None of those are necessarily controversial. If you don't think that the president should be there to enrich himself and his family, then that shouldn't be something you think about.
Thank you. Rebecca, you've been studying election law for a long time, and I'd like to ask you to give us some historical context of what's going on now. One argument being made by some Republicans is that what's happening in these several contested states is no different than what happened with Bush versus Gore in Florida in 2000, and that we should just allow the process to play out at the state level and not get anxious about having a president-elect before the 15th of December or even later than that. In what ways is the current maneuvering similar to what we saw 20 years ago, and in what ways is it different?
So, I think it's perfectly fair and correct that candidates, when elections are close, have numerous levers at their disposal in terms of challenging the results. There's recounts. States have contest and protest provisions that allow candidates to challenge the results, and they can challenge them on a number of bases. First, in a recount scenario, you're just asking for the votes to be recounted to make sure that the tabulation was correct. But in a challenge or a protest, you're actually alleging either official misconduct or fraud or some other problem that tainted the results. And so candidates in our system are allowed to pursue those avenues. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. It's part of our system. It's routine after every election. In almost every state, there's some close election or some contest that gives rise to this type of process. And that's what happened in Bush versus Gore, where you had an extraordinarily close election. When the dust settled, there were 537 votes separating the 2 candidates in the state that the entire election came down to. So it was quite an extraordinary situation for that reason. Typically this is a process that happens in state courts. And that's of course what unfolded in Florida to some degree, except for the Bush campaign ended up taking the case to federal court on a federal question involving the Equal Protection Clause of the US Constitution and the Electoral Account Act. But that's where the similarities between what happened in 2000 and what's happening today end. Because although some of the post-election processes that we've seen are typical in the sense that I think there's been a request to, for example, have a recount in a couple of counties in Wisconsin. And of course, the audit that's happening in Georgia it's very strange, actually, but it's relatively routine in that it's being ordered by the Secretary of State. But as Benji was mentioning earlier, the allegations that have been brought forward so far are not typical. They're very strange, actually. If you read them, it's sort of hard to parse what's going on because, for example, the allegation will be, this observer was not allowed to watch this process and therefore we should throw out 600,000 votes. Or there's some minor, allegation about, absentee vote processes that should result in all absentee votes being tossed. And so these sort of frivolous arguments that are sort of evidence-free don't rise to the level of the type of claim that would, number one, have any chance of winning in court, and number two, have any chance of changing the results in either any particular state or, of course, in the election, in the electoral college vote. So it's in my mind, you go to Bush versus Gore immediately when you think about presidential, post-election processes, but really it's really not at all relevant to the current situation we find ourselves in, which has much more to do with, I think, stoking partisanship and confusion than it does with actually bringing viable claims in court.
Thank you. We're about halfway through our time together this afternoon, and I would really like to hear from some of our audience, particularly the law students. So if you wanted to go ahead and sorry, we're about halfway through our time together, and I would like to hear from some in our audience, especially our law students. So if you wanted to go ahead and put some questions into chat, we'll try to get to them in a few minutes. But I wanted to go back to the three panelists and see if you either wanted to respond to something that one of the others has said, or if you wanted to give us a new topic, something that perhaps hasn't been addressed yet in terms of what's going on around the country, or what perhaps the role of the courts will be in sorting out these various and sundry challenges.
Ken, I would jump in. Rebecca did a great job talking about Bush v. Gore and the past Supreme Court litigation. So one potential possibly frightening scenario is Bush v. Gore dealt primarily with the counting of the votes, how Florida was able to count votes. And you have lawsuits that either require states to count more or count fewer votes. But what about the next level? What if states finish counting votes and then have, for example, 2 sets of electors sent to DC, or don't send any electors to DC? So to me, that would be an even more extreme situation. And I don't know if either Rebecca or Benji have thought about this. But to me, that would be a little more threatening. People are often talking about Trump. Part of Trump or the Republicans' goal is to basically cast doubt on Biden's presidency. So over the next 4 years, people can say he's not the legitimate president. And something like that might push it even further in terms of the Senate having to either agree and compromise, say, we're giving this to Biden, but we don't think that there was, the legitimacy of the process. Even if they don't think that they can get 50+1 Senate votes, or the House, you would need possibly more than half of the states to cast their 1 vote per state if you don't get a majority of electoral college votes for one of the candidates. So that's the situation I'm more concerned about. I think there's a low probability of it, but if you get 3 of the states, particularly the 3 I mentioned, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Arizona, and if you get funny business from those states in terms of certifying or not certifying, or even Michigan, you could have a problem.
Boy, I see those as sort of doomsday scenarios that I hope we don't have to address. But I know you election law experts have thought about these alternative scenarios. Benji, what's your response to Jason's question?
So if I can I preface it with just some brief remarks jumping off of what Rebecca said earlier, comparing this to Bush v. Gore and the similarities and differences. I think it's helpful to distinguish between, democracy affirming approaches and democracy undermining approaches. And I think it's useful to think about, both subjective good faith and objective reasonableness. Filing, asking for recounts, if there's a provision to request a recount, exercising those rights, filing lawsuits where you present non-frivolous evidence and make non-frivolous legal arguments, that's totally appropriate. And I think it actually enhances the legitimacy of the democratic process. And I think that, as many non-frivolous lawsuits, the more non-frivolous lawsuits, the better, the more I'm happy for there to be recounts. And if I worked for Trump and Trump said, I don't want to concede right now, I want to use every legal avenue I have to try to see if I can win this election, I would say you don't have to concede right now. And, let's explore your legal options. And there are certain situations where there can be recounts, and there are certain situations where you can make good faith arguments about proper interpretations of state law. What the two arguments that I would say are the most, reasonable is, I don't think it changes any votes, but I think that there are reasonable arguments about, how close election observers should be. I think there's clear reasons in the time of COVID why you might want there to be some distance. I also think that it is problematic if you're so far away that it's hard to observe what's happening. And so I think, I think there can be good faith arguments about where's the right place to strike the balance, how you interpret that. And I think litigation about that is totally fine. The substantive legal argument that I think is the strongest, and I'm not saying that it's right, I'm just saying that it's non-frivolous, is, has to do with late arriving mail ballots in Pennsylvania. This isn't about voter fraud. It's not about election officials who aren't following the law. There was a decision by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court interpreting both the Pennsylvania Election Code and and the Pennsylvania Constitution, saying that what happens when a mail ballot arrives late. And you might argue that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court made the wrong decision, or that the way it made that decision kind of goes beyond, there's an argument about the proper interpretation of Article 2 and what state Supreme Courts can do. If it came down to Pennsylvania and it was super close, then this would be more like Bush v. Gore. But so that stuff is totally fine. I think that there's some stuff that's clearly not, that is democracy undermining, which is, wild allegations and misrepresentation and disinformation online. And then, there's some conduct, which Jason was talking about, where I think you can argue about whether people can, in good faith, objectively think that it's democracy enhancing to engage in this. And this is stuff like, can state legislatures, if they have concerns about the process, can they try to appoint a different slate of electors or try to prevent the certification in the state? And then what Congress can do. I don't think I think you can come up with nightmare scenarios where there's not a legal consensus about what would happen. I think that the chance of that happening is very unlikely. But, I think we could spin out scenarios. There is this statute called the Electoral Account Act, which is supposed to guide the process by which Congress counts these votes. And we know some things about how it's supposed to work, but I don't think the Electoral Account Act is bulletproof in that it ensures interpretive consensus in every possible scenario. So you could spin out some scenarios where it's not clear what would happen under the Electoral Account Act, and I don't know if there is a good answer to what would happen, except it would be profoundly disruptive and chaotic, and a very it would be a democratic disaster.
Rebecca, anything to either respond to Jason or Benji, or a new question to throw out?
Yeah, I guess I would just add, because I agree with everything that Benji just said. I guess I would just add, in terms of the idea of a state legislature deciding to appoint its own slate of electors, or to have some kind of mischief afoot at electoral college meetings in the states. My feeling, and maybe this is a Pollyanna approach, I don't know, but my feeling is that without credible allegations of fraud, in other words, without evidence to suggest or to show that there had actually been a problem with the votes, I can't imagine that legislators who take the oath of office would throw an election in an evidence-free environment. I just can't believe that would actually unfold. And likewise, if it did get to Congress, and if Congress did have to evaluate different slates of electors, first of all, the Electoral Account Act does require the slate of elector appointed by the chief executive in the state, which is, there's some disagreement about who that is, but it's either the governor or the Secretary of State. In some of the states that are involved here, even though there are Republican legislatures, there are Democratic governors and appointed secretaries of state. So I guess what I'm getting at is, I think you'd have to have a whole lot of malfeasance on the part of our elected representatives to sort of overlook the rule of law and make determinations based on no evidence. And I think that would be extraordinary, and I think it would be disruptive, and I just don't think it would happen. So unless credible evidence emerges of nationwide fraud and conspiracy, like I just don't see our elected representatives taking us down that road.
Can I just add briefly to that? I agree with everything that Rebecca said. I think it's important to note that in both 2000, after Bush v. Gore, and in 2016, when Trump won the election, there were some members of the House who made objections to the counting of electoral votes during that joint session of Congress. But it failed. Under the Electoral Account Act, it needs to be in writing, and it needs to be signed by both a representative and a senator. And there were a bunch of representatives who tried to pose objections, but it was not in writing, and they had no senator joining them. And I think it's important to note that in 2000, remember that this joint session of Congress is presided over by the president of the Senate, who is the vice president. Al Gore presided over the counting of the votes in 2000 that awarded the election to President Bush. And Al Gore enforced the rules of the Electoral Account Act and insisted that everything had to be in writing and joined by both a representative and a senator. And in 2016, the exact same thing happened with Democrats trying to pose certain objections to the counting of electoral votes for President Trump, but it wasn't in writing, and they didn't have a senator joining them. And in that case, the person presiding, the president of the Senate, was Vice President Joe Biden. And if it would be useful for people, I could show like a 30-second clip of what actually happened in 2016 during the joint session of Congress, when some Democratic representatives tried to pose objections, and Joe Biden presiding said, "It's over, it's over. This is not happening." And there was a round of applause. And then they proceeded with the vote counting, and it resulted in exactly the result that was predicted by media outlets and everybody who were observing it in advance. Should I do like a quick 30-second clip of this?
Sure, if you've got that ready to show, that would be great, and that would give some of our audience time to formulate a question or two.
Okay, let me try to do this.
you long-form public affairs programming.
Mr. Blunt. Mr. President, the undersigned, Roy Blunt and Amy Klobuchar, tellers on the part of the Senate, Greg Harper and Robert A. Brady, tellers on the part of the House of Representatives of the United States for the term beginning on the... Delivered to the President. Donald Trump of New York has received, for President of the United States, 304 votes. Hillary Clinton, the state of New York, has received 227 votes. Colin Powell from the Commonwealth of Virginia has received 3 votes. John Casey, the state of Ohio, has received 1 vote. Ron Paul of the state of Texas has received 1 vote. Bernie Sanders of the state of Vermont has received 1 vote. Faith Spotted Eagle of the state of South Dakota has received 1 vote. The state of the vote for Vice President of the United States as delivered to the President of the Senate is as follows. The whole number of the electors appointed to vote for Vice President of the United States is 538, of which 207 Vice President. In the gallery. Elizabeth Warren of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts received 2, has received 1. The change will be in order. Minnesota has received 1 vote. This announcement of the state on the 20th day of January 2000, pursuant to the Senate of the 115th Congress, the chair declares the joint session dissolved.
So, you know, people protested and some representatives posed objections, but the process worked smoothly and Trump won.
Benji, where did all those random votes for Bernie Sanders and Colin Powell and John Kasich come from? Were those
so that's faithless electors, right?
Faithless electors.
Yeah. So that is people who want to serve as presidential electors. They sign a pledge in advance. They make a pledge in advance to support the nominee of their party. But then after they're appointed, they decide that they want to break their pledge. And we had a couple US Supreme Court cases. One decades ago said that states can require the pledge on the front end. And then this past summer, in a case called Chiafalo versus Washington, the US Supreme Court unanimously said that states can enforce that pledge, not just by fining somebody for breaking their pledge, but by removing them if they try to break their pledge. And so I think it is very unlikely that the results of the 2020 presidential election are going to be determined by faithless electors.
We've got a question in chat from Julia, who is wondering, how do you believe the recounts and allegations will affect the Electoral College voting in December? I think we've touched on some of aspects of that, but maybe perhaps you could tell us what we should be watching for over the next 3 weeks or so between now and December 14th. What might be significant points that would indicate that either the election is going to be resolved or that the disputes are going to be prolonged. Anyone want to take a stab at that? Jason first.
Well, I would say unless you find more memory chips like they did in Georgia that weren't counted, I don't think the recounts, there's enough votes that haven't been counted or there's close enough margins given how many votes change, particularly at the top of the ticket. A lot of times votes at the bottom of the ballot where people weren't paying as much attention or they weren't sure who they were voting for, there you can see greater fluctuations. But I'm pretty sure most people who went into the ballot booth in 16 days ago knew who they were voting for and had good reasons or bad reasons, but knew who they were voting for. I think really the significance of recounts goes to this possibility of Republican leaders using the failure of a recount or fraud within a recount or their accusations of that to invalidate the elections and try to send different electors. The governor in Arizona and in Georgia are both Republicans, and they have Republican-controlled governments. You know, Pennsylvania has a Democratic governor, but a Republican legislature. So any of those bodies can take action to try to send a different set of electors. Benji gave a great example when Vice President Biden was sitting over the Senate, when Nixon was sitting over the Senate as vice president. A similar thing happened where in Hawaii, they had an initial count that came out for, it wasn't for Kennedy, but then they did the recount and it was for Kennedy. So they actually had two slates going to Washington. And so Nixon, as the vice president, suggested, without the intent of establishing a precedent, that the latter and more recent certification of Senator Kennedy be accepted so as not to delay the further count of electoral votes. And that was agreed to by unanimous consent. So I think there's enough things that have happened over the past where you could see something like this happen. And again, it's going to come down to the House and the Senate in various phases to what they want to do with this.
Benji or Rebecca, do you want to respond to sort of what might happen in the next 3 weeks?
Well, I think Jason is perfectly correct that, you know, recounts don't tend to change results. I think there have been two statewide presidential recounts, 2000 and then in Wisconsin in 2016. And in both cases, the numbers changed by, I think it was something like 500 votes in one and 1,000 votes in the other. So certainly nothing that would make up the margins that currently separate the candidates. So I don't think we can expect to see recounts changing anything in the lead up to December 14th. And then in terms of the other allegations of fraud, again, I don't think if there's no there, I don't think a state representative would have a hat to hang on anything. So, again, I think, you have to believe that elected representatives are going to act in a principled way. And if they can find a way to act in a principled way to, subvert the will of the people, they might try. But to try and do so in an unprincipled way seems like a recipe for revolt and, demonstrations in the street. And I just don't see that happening.
And I just briefly add, just the timeline is that, Electoral College Day, when the electors actually vote, is December 14th this year. And it's January 6th when there's going to be the joint session of Congress where those votes are counted. There's something called the safe harbor deadline. And the idea is, according to this federal law, the Electoral Account Act, if states submit their electoral resolve all controversies about who the electors are 6 days before the voting, then it will be presumed, conclusively correct during the joint session of Congress. And so people might talk about this December 8th deadline. And what they're referring to is that if states complete the certification process and do everything they need to do to say, here's our slate of electors, by December 8th, then that triggers this presumption of that's the conclusive slate for that state before the joint session of Congress on January 6th.
We have a number of journalism students in the audience today, as well as law students. And on behalf of those journalism students, my colleague Glenn Mosley wonders if the panelists could comment on the important role that journalists play, given what is said in court versus what is said in a press conference, as Benji mentioned in his opening remarks. What is the role of the media in disseminating fair and accurate information about this election to the public? So, Benji, maybe you can start.
Oh, sure.
So, does my voice sound like Darth Vader? Okay, I apologize. I recently moved my home office to the second floor so kids could play, but now my Wi-Fi's too weak and I sound like Darth Vader. Should I stop talking because I sound like Darth Vader, or is it okay if I keep talking like Darth Vader? Okay.
You can keep going.
So I think there's a problem that the financial incentives for media companies, it's very dramatic to cover the election as a horse race where they report the vote totals as they're being reported. It makes it super exciting. But I think that it's very misleading. And I think that they should consider Just they should consider not talking about it the way that they talk about it, not presenting it as though, so don't use phrases like Trump is leading by 15,000 votes. Because it's not a sports game where Trump just scored 15,000 votes and then in the future Biden may or may not score some more votes. All the votes were already cast. We're just counting them, right? You know, it's like watching a sports. It's like instead of watching the sports game, somebody else watches the game. They count this. They count the points kind of randomly, right? They might report inning second, you know, the second inning first, then the seventh inning, then the fifth inning, then the first inning, and somebody just randomly says, "We just got the results in from the sixth inning, and Trump got four home runs." You know, it's just a very weird way to find out who won a baseball game. The way to find it out is just to count all the runs at the end and then report the results. And I think there's really strong kind of civic education, democracy reasons to dramatically change the way that we report on elections. But all of the, you know, all the other pressures that media companies face point in the other direction.
I think I would just add that, you know, there was a huge amount of work that I was involved in partially trying to educate the media about what was going to be different about 2020, particularly with the dramatic rise of absentee ballots during a pandemic and the problem of several states not allowing the votes to be tabulated until just before or even on election day. So we knew that there was going to be this sort of delayed result, and we spent a lot of time educating members of the media about this. And I actually think, to their credit, the media has done an outstanding job, not only of trying to sort of project that message, but also in trying to unpack some of what's happening since the election took place. So, you know, I've talked to a ton of reporters who are really working overtime to try and translate what's happening to the public. And, you know, I think it's really hard to do in the very, you know, polarized environment that they're operating in. But, you know, I think that's the work that needs to be done. And, you know, what else is there to do but to try and help the public understand what's going on.
Jason, anything to add to that?
I'm a little less positive about the job the media is doing. And maybe it's because I'm looking at relatively to other countries the same way. I'm less positive about this being a successful elections because it didn't turn to complete pandemonium. If you compare us to Northern Europe and our peers in terms of income and how long we've been a democracy, I think the election wasn't that great. And I think our ability to learn our lessons and move forward in the last few administrations hasn't been great. Kind of to follow on Benji's sports analogy though, do you guys remember the phrase, hate the game, not the player? And it basically alludes to the fact if someone's shooting 3-pointers in basketball and they're winning the games by only doing 3-pointers, they're still following the rules and maybe they're not being fair because they're not trying layups and 2-pointers. But at the end of the day, you got to change the rules if things aren't going the way the system intended it to do. And I think it's a little bit the same way here. If Trump's not breaking the law in fighting to keep the presidency, then I think we're stress testing the system. And I'm pleased to see the courts consistently ruling the same way, not because I agree or disagree with the outcome that they're allowing, but it's really because they're not interfering in the outcome. They're letting the votes stand for the most part. And I think the count so far, only one lawsuit out of the 30 has been successful. And that was a lawsuit in Pennsylvania that dealt with how many days they were allowed to accept ballots after election day with the postmark. So I think that's a stress test that shows the system is working because the courts aren't interfering in a controversial way in the election. So they're letting the politicians be politicians, but at the end of the day, the courts are standing up for the voters. So that to me is the highlight of this scenario.
Well, as Judy Woodruff says to Mark Shields and David Brooks on the NewsHour every Friday, I'd like to go back to each of the panelists for just a 1-minute summation or some final words to send us on our way as we look for some resolution here in the next couple weeks. And so, Rebecca, would you like to start? Anything that we didn't cover that ought to be mentioned?
Well, I guess, it's clear that in the audience we have law students and, students of journalism. And I just want to emphasize the important role that you all have, in, making our system work. And, I think this election has given you a front row seat to all the many problems that, our system engenders. And I hope that in your ways, either as lawyers or as journalists, that, you'll be a part of the solution, because we desperately need reform, and we desperately need to sort of fix some of these very deep-seated problems. So I'll just leave it there.
So Benji, anything in terms of a final thought?
So I really like the way that Rebecca started, and I think that that's a really helpful framework, that despite all the problems and concerns that people had, we had a successful election in the middle of a pandemic with, higher voter turnout than we'd ever had. And, I think that journalists are trying to respond in and trying to be clear about what is and what is not happening. I think that the courts, it's kind of a stress test for a bunch of different aspects of our system. And I think that I'm hopeful that we're passing the test. But I do think there's something very concerning and kind of sad about just the extreme misinformation and polarization. And the final thing I'd say is I did a radio show locally here right after the election, and a lot of people who called in were Trump supporters, and whatever you think, over 70 million people voted for Donald Trump, whether he wins or loses. There are 70 million people voted for him. And a lot of them are very upset about the election results. And they're hearing all sorts of things about, claims of fraud. And a lot of the people calling in were worried about stuff. It's kind of like whack-a-mole, where, you can, if you do enough research, you can do the fact check on it and kind of debunk it. But I'm really worried about those people. I'm worried about Trump supporters who are just facing an ocean of misinformation, and I'm worried about them. I'm hopeful that what happens will give them confidence in the legitimacy of the system, but I'm worried about the misinformation that they face.
Jason, any hopes, fears, or parting words?
I would say, I second what Rebecca was saying about the media, and for all the journalism students who are paying attention, we're encouraging you to do great work and stay in your fields and providing kind of investigative journalism we need for our democracy to work, because our democracy, any democracy, won't work without the fourth branch of government. And we've talked in the past about social media and the role it plays, and it comes down to the consumer of the news, to the voter, to the citizens, to force the news providers to provide the type of news that you find useful. And I think we can't shift our focus away from two of the bigger problems in our democracy. It's not the electoral college system, it's the money in politics that shifts who gets elected. And I think the fact that Benji was saying 70 million people voted for Trump shows there's a lot of dissatisfaction with what the other party was offering, and a lot of people who weren't necessarily voting for Trump because of what he'd done policy-wise, but because they didn't think the system's working. And the second part of that, not only the money in politics, but we have this two-party system where the extreme candidate from either party tends to rise through the system because of the primaries, rather than the more moderate, middle-of-the-road candidate who might be more palatable to the entire jurisdiction, whether it's a county, state, or country. So those are two things I think we need to focus on. I don't think it's necessarily the system. The system passed the stress test, but it's the fact that we're getting candidates that don't seem to be where the middle of the road American wants to see people.
This has been a terrific panel, and I'm just delighted that this may be the most geographically diverse panel we've had with Jason and Benji in Boise and Rebecca from the East Coast, and students and faculty joining us from all over Idaho. Before we let our panelists go, I'd like to invite everyone in the audience, if you could turn on your camera and give a virtual round of applause, or in Zoom, put up a hand to show how much you appreciate the folks that have given their time and expertise. And it's always a pleasure to engage with an interdisciplinary panel on a topic of high public interest. So thanks all of you. This program was recorded. It will be available on the Renfrew Colloquium's YouTube channel, probably about noon on Friday. So if you have friends that are interested in the topic that couldn't join us for the real-time broadcast, hope that they can watch it later on. Again, thank you everybody for being with us. Our next colloquium, Tuesday, December 1st, and watch for the details of that right after Thanksgiving.